Now, within any business's policy should be a commitment to adopting a more environmentally aware approach. Road transport accounts for a third of the UK's greenhouse gases, so it's key for businesses to assess what types of vehicles they should be looking at for a greener future, as well as how to change their travel policies to be less damaging to the environment. Well, we're now joined by Jonathan Shopley from the CarbonNeutral company to outline some of the important issues. Good to see you, Jonathan.
Thank you.
Let's start by talking about the CarbonNeutral company. What exactly do you do?
We tackle climate change, so we work mainly with businesses around the world to help them develop carbon management strategies so that they're able to grow their businesses, top line and bottom line, while at the same time they reduce their greenhouse gas emissions.
Okay, so in terms of companies here in the UK, why should companies make their vehicles greener?
Well, as you pointed out, about 30% of the UK's emissions come from transport, which means that about 30% of most companies' emissions are associated with their transport activities. But if I just back up one moment, the importance of dealing with climate change really stems back to the science, which says that we have a real problem. We have to, in absolute terms, figure out ways of growing our global economy while reducing our greenhouse gas emissions by about 60 to 80% by mid-century. Now, at the moment, most nations are increasing their greenhouse gas emissions at the fastest rate in recorded history. So we really do have an issue. So why do companies look at transport? And why do companies look to control their greenhouse gas emissions? It's a business strategy issue. We know that there'll be increasing rules and regulations and costs associated with greenhouse gas emissions way into the future. And the things that we do now, the cars that we buy now, the transport policies that we adopt now affect the costs we're going to face into the future. So most of the clients we're working with now may not be required by regulation to do anything, but feel that this is strategically important to figure out what they're going to do.
Because that's really the question, is whether the businesses are being forced by government to comply, whether it's something that they feel that they ought to be doing, or is it actually the cost implication?
I think it's a combination of all of that. So if you look at the HSBC, for example, they 3 years ago made a commitment to going carbon neutral, be the first global bank to do so. Not required by any laws to do that, but they saw a range of benefits, cost benefits, points of differentiation, opportunities to talk to their customers about a pressing issue that made that feel like the right strategic move for that company. And many of their suppliers have decided to do the same thing.
Okay, you mentioned the science at the top, and I do think there are people out there who are anxious about the science. How accurate is the science now?
It's a very difficult question to answer, but I believe that a consensus, a vast majority of the world's scientists believe that anthropogenic sources of greenhouse gas emissions are dramatically changing the climate. And I think the point that's been made by economists like Sir Nick Stern here in the UK is that businesses are used to dealing with risks and uncertainties. We do that all the time in our marketing plans and new products we introduce. And we've been presented by scientists with a risk, a real risk where the probability is quite high that we're going to change the climate in a way that negatively affects the environment, the economy, and basically our quality of life. So based on that risk probability, we need to figure out what we're going to do about it.
But if you're, say, an SME in the UK, you're a relatively small player on a global market, do you find that it's quite difficult to convince some businesses that they ought to be doing something when they then turn around to you and say, well, actually, look, we're actually not contributing that much if you look at the global market?
Well, I think for a range of reasons, a growing number of businesses are taking action, even well ahead of regulation, pre-compliance or beyond compliance, or going beyond their regulatory requirements. And they're doing that because of the strategic imperative that I mentioned. Everybody senses that, we've seen the government raise the vehicle tax on large polluting vehicles. We know that the European Union is introducing new standards for fuel efficiencies of cars. So people sort of sense these things are coming down the pike. But at the same time, at the other sort of end of the scale, companies, law firms, for example, that have gone carbon neutral by measuring their emissions, reducing them, and then offsetting the parts that they can't avoid, do that primarily in the war for talent. Most companies are out there hiring people whose personal values are aligned with concerns about climate. And they like to work with companies that have taken a proactive position on that. So for a range of reasons, from staff engagement right through to anticipating government regulation to gain strategic or business advantage, means that more and more companies are getting involved in carbon management programs.
Okay, so let's go back to the vehicles. What can businesses do then to make their vehicles greener?
Sure. So let's sort of back up a moment again. It's about transport. It's about moving people around. And when we move people around, there are lots of things that affect that. Where we place our buildings, the commute that we ask people to do, how we exercise our business, which vehicles we purchase, what fuel we put in those vehicles, and how we drive them. So sort of taking it from the top. There's a lot that companies can do to avoid or reduce their emissions from transport by simply not traveling, by displacing some business travel with video conferencing where that's possible, thinking about how they locate their major offices and allowing people to share their trips into work, use public transport. The government in the UK has introduced a cycle to work scheme, which is moving people out of cars onto bicycles where applicable. Once we get into, right, we know that we're going to be dependent on vehicles, let's figure out which ones we're going to buy. The smaller the vehicle, the better. So the difference between a 2-litre vehicle and a 1.4-litre vehicle is quite marked. It's about a 25% reduction in emissions. So we see some companies saying, look, we're not going to be nanny-ish to our employees. We're not going to tell them which cars they can purchase. We're going to encourage them. We're going to give them certain benefits. Sky, for example, gives £1,000 off to employees choosing a hybrid vehicle, which has got a much lower greenhouse gas emission profile than that classic petrol car. There are certain fuels that are better for climate change. And LPG is better than diesel, which is better than petrol, for example. And then, of course, there are a whole range of vehicles out there, these hybrid vehicles and electric vehicles that are beginning to introduce low carbon or no carbon alternatives to travel. But let's be realistic about this. Some of those cars are perhaps not very attractive. Some are not particularly safe because they're quite small. They don't make any noise. Pedestrians step out in front of electric vehicles. That's been quoted as a bit of an issue. There are all sorts of things about fueling those vehicles. So we try and be very pragmatic in our advice and say to people, we need to sort of think about upgrading fleets, giving people encouragement to stay out of cars as much as possible and then choose the most energy efficient cars. And then look at the new technologies that are coming to market, electric fueled vehicles in particular, and see whether they can be introduced into the fleet.
Okay, so where can businesses go for more information if they are committed to changing their transport policies?
Well, here in the UK, the Department of Transport's got quite a lot of information on its website. The Energy Savings Trust has a website that focuses a lot on transport, and our own website, the CarbonNeutral.com website, has information about this.
Okay, fantastic stuff. Thank you. Great advice. And I hope businesses will take on board what you've said. Thank you very much indeed for coming in.
It's a pleasure. Thank you.